has been assisted by the Australian government through the Australia Council, its arts funding and advisory body. As panelists we have in our midst Dr. Coleman, Ms. Jeanine, Ms. Munkara, Mr. Brenton McKenna. The moderator for the session would be Ms. Mridula Chakraborthy. Dr. Coleman is of Kukata First Nation Australian Aboriginal and Greek ancestry. She lectures in Indigenous Health at the University of Adelaide in South Australia after completing her PhD at the same university. The creative component of Dr. Coleman's PhD work, Mason Grace, based on her mother's childhood growing up on Kunipa mission under oppressive colonial government policies, including segregation of the 1940s and 50s, was written in Aboriginal English and Kukata language. This won the Australian David Unipen Indigenous Literary Award, was longlisted for the Stella Prize and shortlisted for the Commonwealth Book Prize. Ms. Jeanine is a Wiradjuri woman from New South Wales. A doctorate in literature and Aboriginal representation followed a long teaching career at secondary and tertiary level. Formerly a research fellow at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, she currently holds a postdoctoral fellowship at ANU. Her first volume of poetry, Dark Secrets After Dreaming, AD 1887-1961, won the Scanlon Prize for Indigenous Poetry from the Australian Poets Union and her manuscript. Purple Threads won the David Unipen Award at the Queensland Premier's Literary Awards and is shortlisted for the 2012 Commonwealth Book Prize and the Victorian Premier's Literary Awards. Ms. Munkara is of Rembaranga, TV and Chinese descent. Her first novel, Every Secret Thing, won the David Unipen Award and the Northern Territories Book of the Year. Her two children's books are Rusty Brown and Rusty and Jojo, and her second novel is A Most Peculiar Act. Mr. Brenton McKenna is an Indigenous writer-illustrator from Broome in the far northwest of Australia. He studied visual arts at Coleman Taffy and was awarded a mentorship with the Australian Society of Authors. He was a Deadly Award nominee and winner of the Kulari Naidok Award for Literature. Abhi's Underdogs is his first graphic novel. Dr. Mridula Chakraborthy, a lecturer at the University of Western Sydney, teaches and publishes on literatures of the subcontinent. Edited essays, being Bengali at home and in the world, and co-edited a treasury of Bangla stories. Translations have appeared in The Table is Laid, the Oxford Anthology of South Asian Food Writing, The Lotus Singers, Stories from Contemporary South Asia, The Picador Book from Modern Indian Literature, The Bell and Other Stories, and The Wordsmiths. Recipient of A.K. Ramanujan Award for the most felicitous translations from two Indian languages, Bangla and Hindi, into English, she curates the project Literary Commons, which takes 14 Indigenous writers to Indian literary festivals and seeks to make connections between Indigenous and Dalit literatures. Over to you, panelists.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me better? Yeah? It's my great pleasure today to introduce to you four absolutely wonderful writers, visiting writers from Australia, but even more than that, what I like to call Australia's best kept secret. These are writers belonging to various Indigenous nations, various Indigenous languages, and in the last 30 years, Indigenous literature in Australia has had a tremendous literary renaissance, which parallels some of the efflorescence that is happening in Dalit literature in India. So this project is about making connections between Indigenous writers of Australia and Indigenous writers of India. So I realize that many of us here probably don't have an idea about what Indigenous writing in Australia is really about, which is why I keep on calling it Australia's best kept secret. So we're looking at this panel as a kind of 3-minute introduction to some of the issues that are current in Indigenous writing in Australia today. So I'll start with Dylan Coleman. And Dylan, one of the first things that many audiences in India say when we talk about Indigenous writers from Australia or Indigenous people from Australia is that you don't look Indigenous. So can you talk a little bit about what does it mean when people say that to you and what your response is and what is the historical background behind Indigenous people in Australia?
Hello, and thank you for having us. It's an enormous privilege to be here. Nalgu Gugada Weena, Nalgu Olden Munagu Manda Balya, Nalgu Weirda Mercy, Nalgu Weirda Pearly, Nalgu Weena Muga Gantaganti, Nalgu Garadu Manadu. I've just, in my own language, said thank you for having us, that I'm a Gugada Aboriginal woman. I come from a strong line of Gugada women, my mother Mercy, my grandmother Pearly, and that my heart feels very big and full for the privilege of being here, so thank you. I get asked that question sometimes. People say, you don't look Aboriginal. My mother is an Aboriginal woman and my father is a Greek man, but I've been brought up, as I said, with a strong line of Gugada women, and so my mother's brought me up to be very strong within my own culture and my language. Being Aboriginal is not about the colour of our skin, because with the colonial history, when the English came to Australia, they looked at us as being less than, and in terms of this ladder of civilization that we had, we were one step up from monkeys according to them in this ideology. As a result of that, we have experienced enormous desecration of our people through genocide to begin with, through massacres, and then later through government policies that have sought to breed the whiteness out of, the blackness out of our skin. So Aboriginal people hold strong to their identity, and basically we see our identity as a socially constructed identity. We have blood lineages, but also it's enormously important in terms of our environment and how we see ourselves and our backgrounds. So I hope that sort of answers your question, and I'm sure that everyone's got a different perspective but similar again.
In fact, thank you for that. In fact, Mari, if we go over to you now, you said at a panel the day before yesterday that you think of yourself as a writer first and Indigenous later on, but how do you separate the indigeneity and the writing experience? If you would like to speak about that, but also to give our audience an idea of the enormous diversity among Indigenous people in Australia.
Oh gosh, where do I start? Yeah, well that's true. I do see myself as a writer first, an Indigenous who happens to be an Indigenous person. And my writing is for me, and but because of my life experiences, and we were very good writing about our life experiences, so because of mine, I can't but help but have Indigenous content in my books and in my writings. But I do also write about non-Indigenous stuff. I write about a lot of stuff. So, yeah, I just, for me, I don't know, it's not something that's a focus for me, and but it's there. It's part of my writing because it's just part of my life. So.
Thank you, Mary. Jeanine, if I may turn to you now and ask there were about 600 indigenous languages at one point of time in Australia, and today there are 30 surviving, and the indigenous communities all across Australia still trying to preserve the 30 languages and an extremely strong oral literature. But contemporary indigenous writing is also adapting to all kinds of different genres. So there's poetry, prose, non-fiction, memoir, paranormal, romance, comedy, all kinds of graphic novels, all kinds of fiction, all kinds of genres in which indigenous writers are writing today. So Jeanine, could you speak a little bit about how genre, as defined by the Western canon, how it limits or enables indigenous expression?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, look, first of all, I would like to echo Dylan's message. Look, thank you, Bangalore. It's a great pleasure to be here. Yes, in terms of genre, and I'd first of all like to start by saying that the very act of any Indigenous person writing, whether it's published or even not published, is a political act, is by nature and definition a political act. And to backtrack a little further, to Indigenous societies being described also, as Dylan alluded to, social Darwinism and hierarchies of human beings. To describe Indigenous society as illiterate before the arrival and invasion subsequently by the British is also a major mistake, but because we were literate in a very different way. To start with, we read country and seasons and land and migratory paths of animals very, very, very articulately. We're also made particular marks on rocks, stones, different natural features that actually could be read by each other. It's just the British who couldn't read that. So I would first of all like to address that question and interrogate that whole notion of Indigenous people as illiterate to begin with, because we never were. And one of the things, I wrote about many things in my novel, but one of the things I wrote about was the irony of the settler farmers calling Indigenous people illiterate when they were always struggling with droughts and fires and floods, and those things are natural phenomena, but they just couldn't predict them. They couldn't read the landscape in a way that Aboriginal people could read the landscape. But now to look at English and the idea of genre, Indigenous people around the Sydney area where the British first came adapted writing in English very early. The earliest example, this may not be the first one, but the earliest recorded example of Indigenous writing is 1796, which is less than 10 years, after the invasion. And that was a guy called Bennelong who wrote a petition to Lord Sydney Stuart to be sent to Britain. And that was a very political act. He was talking about the dispossession of Aboriginal people in 1796. But then to move on to the groundswell of Aboriginal writing that Mridula has talked about in the last 20 to 30 years, and the idea of genre, many of the Western genres are reductionist as far as Aboriginal writing is concerned. I'm not saying that they're not appropriate in their own context. I'm saying that out of context, they are not always appropriate. And to give a particular example, I'd like to talk about Aboriginal life writing, which sometimes gets categorised as autobiography because there is one storyteller. But it's actually not autobiography, and that definition is very fraught, because autobiography is an Enlightenment term and it means of the self, of the individual. And it's also a term that implies prose. Whereas Aboriginal life writing, even if there is one storyteller, it's a collective memoir drawing on many stories and adhering to many protocols before you actually even get to write those stories. whereas I think Western autobiography is often written as an individualistic thing. And also on the idea of life writing, Aboriginal poetry is also, people don't often think about poetry as life writing, but much Aboriginal poetry is actually life writing. And to draw an example from my own poetry, Dark Secrets, it follows a very distinct historical sequence from the invasion of Wiradjuri lands right up until the 1960s. And each poem speaks back to a Western historical construct, which is not appropriate for Aboriginal people, and interrogates national myths about Australia, like Australia is a land of promise, or Australia is, because we all grew up with learning these things in history books. Australia is a nation of opportunity, a workers' paradise. Each one of these particular poems speaks back to one of those from an Aboriginal perspective, and it is history in poetry. And so therefore, Aboriginal writing blurs and interrogates all those compartments that were set up by the Western literary tradition. And that is very exciting in many ways, but it can also be, in some ways, a barrier to people getting published, because the writing doesn't fit a particular genre, or publishers tend to focus on particular areas, like they focus, for example, Aboriginal Studies Press might focus on non-fiction, but the whole idea, the whole binary between fiction and non-fiction is worth interrogating. Other publishers don't publish, for example, poetry. They only publish history, but that fails to do that. You're actually cutting your nose off as far as Aboriginal writing is concerned. And some of the best historical writing, actually, from Aboriginal people has come in the form of activist poetry. So that's, from an intellectual perspective, I'd like to think that that's where the intellectual thought, and I think there's enough Aboriginal writers and scholars now to sort of drive this, and people like Mridula too, who has done a lot of work with Aboriginal writers to actually drive this. This conversation really needs to happen in the academy now. Western definitions and Aboriginal writing, and they don't have to actually fit each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanine. Speaking of genre, we now turn to Brenton McKenna, who's a graphic novelist, and he's also from a hybrid background. So he's of Malay and Indigenous origin, and he's using a kind of hybrid form in his graphic novels as well. So would you like to speak a little bit, Brenton, in terms of your community, your background, and why the graphic novel became so important for you?
Hey everyone, how are you going? Yeah, I'd just like to continue on with everyone else. You were saying it's great to be here. Thanks for having us. I feel very welcome. I've already been mistaken for local, so yeah, it's awesome. Everyone's the same colour as I am, so yeah, cool. Yeah, sorry. My sort of area of literature is graphic novels. Is basically just another word for comic books. You know, so I write and illustrate my own comic books. But my first series is called Love is Underdogs, which is it has a lot to do with Broome, where I come from, which is a very, very multicultural town. It's just not purely based on Indigenous culture, but a lot of the cultures that came to Broome were just for quilting. And when I say that, I mean everybody. I think you know, Chinese, Japanese, as well as Indian and Sri Lankan, French, Italian. All these people from across the world came to Broome, and with them they brought their culture and their folklore and their ghost stories and a lot of the things, and kind of fermented what they were in Broome, and now you sort of get this mixing pot of just beautiful different cultures, you know. So my comic was kind of based on where all of that began, you know. So yeah, so even myself, because a lot of publishers said that to me when I went looking for publishers. They all said no for the pure reason that they don't like graphic. They don't publish graphic novels, and all of them said, "Why don't you make this a novel?" You know, and I did give it a try. I really did, but it's like to sort of do a graphic novel. to do a novel and not a graphic novel, almost kind of denying what I was, you know, like I learned how to read from comic books, you know, like I couldn't read at all until I was about 9 and picked up a ghostwriter comic book, and that was the rest of my career, you know, like I got a comic book every week, I learned how to draw, I learned how to read, and eventually one thing led to another, and now, almost like 20 years later, I'm a graphic novelist. So it had to be a graphic novel for sure. And, but yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you, Brenton. Thank you, Brenton. Can you hear me? Yeah. Dylan, would you like to speak a little bit about some of the things that have happened in terms of Australia's different policies? For example, the stolen generation, how it was a very, very traumatic event for the Indigenous peoples of Australia, but how it also gave birth to an entire body of writing. People who are coming out of that heritage.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak briefly, but I'm wondering whether Marie would want to speak about that too. Yeah, because of her personal experience. I myself am not a Stolen Generation member, but the Stolen Generation, which has been termed in Australia, refers to government policy that basically in terms of government policy there was a policy vacuum when the British first came, and so there was this sort of outlawness in terms of approaches to Indigenous people and why so many of us died. After that period of time, the governing bodies decided that protection needed to happen in terms of Aboriginal people, a very paternalistic view in terms of how we were looked at as not quite human. But as part of those social Darwinist beliefs that were applied at that time, there was the thought that we would die out as a race. And so this idea of protecting us was enormously important according to the British, or the colonial bodies that had control over the governments at that time. And so protectors were brought into place, and people were basically segregated. They were rounded up, taken off their country. We have historically, and many of us still today, have very rich connections to our culture and our land. And we have what's called the dreaming stories, our dreaming, or Jokuba, which is the creation, which connects us to all things to do with our spiritual belief systems and our country. And so you can imagine that being uprooted from our land and being forced onto missions and reservations, or in some cases stations, and used for basically what amounted to slave labour. In many places, people were enormously traumatised. Part of those policies, from protection to segregation and onto assimilation, that there was a belief that we needed to blend in and become part of the broader white population, also brought with it government policies where children who were born who had fairer skin were taken away from their family members and placed with non-Indigenous families or within institutions. My mother was at Kuneba Mission, and she was punished for speaking her language when she went to school or within the mission system itself. Children were physically punished. They were also discouraged from engaging in any of the ceremonies that kept them strong and healthy in connecting to the land. And although in my mum's book, which is written in Aboriginal English and Gugada, our language, with a glossary at the front, which speaks back to these this particular, can you say, colonial, very destructive process that happened. So in speaking back to that, my mother wanted her story written in Gugada and Aboriginal English. Many children were taken away during this time, and even my mother's youngest brother was taken away, and I think there's statistics like, is it 1 in every 3? That we know 1 in every 3 families have been impacted on by children being taken away. And so, and during that time also a lot of abuse happened to those children. So there's a lot of intergenerational trauma. And might I say that I know in my own experiences and in many Indigenous people's experiences of writing that despite these generations of trauma, that our writing is about liberation, and it's about decolonising and that space that we've lived within, and it's about centering us as Indigenous people, which has been enormously important. But I think in terms of the experience of the stolen generation, that Marie is really well placed to speak about that.
In fact, I'll quickly interject and just say, Marie, your book is a rollicking account. It's told with huge humor and enormous pleasure in the task of storytelling. So if you speak from that perspective.
Yes, look, writing to me is an enjoyable experience. I love every moment of it. But yes, I was taken from my mother. I was one of those kids. But for myself, I don't consider myself to be stolen. I was misappropriated. And I think that what I have done within this is that, I've used a skill of the enemy against them, because I'm a passive resistant fighter. I don't get up there and I don't wave banners and carry on about, the injustices. I'm using against the colonists of our country their own weapon. And so I learned, being taken away, I got a fantastic education. And so from that I can write books, and I can be, who I am within these books, and I can say what I need to in these, because luckily we have the power of free speech in our country still at the moment. So yeah, this is what I've used to say what I need to say. And I must say it's the best. It's what gets me out of bed every day, writing words, and putting down what I feel and how I see the world and how I perceive it. And my nana told me some very important things when I came back and I found my family at the age of 28. She said to me, my girl, she said, you look for a rainbow in every day, don't you? Think about all the bad things, you look for a rainbow, and you just see that you live in a wonderful world and you've been given skills and you use them. And I take my nana's very wise words, I keep them very close, and I look for that every day. So I don't want to be bitter and twisted about what happened to me. It's not nice. I think the injustice was to my mother, because I also got some good things out of this, like the education. But yeah, I've just, I use this opportunity, the life that I've been given, and I'm going to speak, present the world that I've experienced in my way. And by doing that, I do it in a humorous way. I guess, I don't know, I don't say that to make it funny, but it turns out that way. I mean, there's some, I think, if you can talk about something and you can have that humour there, it makes it a lot easier for people to read and to understand and to perceive, because no one wants to be sort of like, slapped around the face and said, this is how it is, and, it was really terrible. Of course it was terrible, but I had some fantastic bits, and the best part out of all of this is that I can put my own words down and I can tell the world how I feel in my own way, and not with bitterness and not with anger.
Jeanine, you have a different perspective on the kind of education that Marie is talking about, because you think that there's a kind of disconnect between what is official education and what gets taught in Indigenous families, the school education and the home education. And you write with great humor and great joy about growing up in your part of the world as well. But would you like to speak a little bit about that?
Thank you. Yes, I spoke about a great disconnect between, and I think that Marie, I don't think we're saying different things there. I think Marie is saying she can see the advantage in what she has, and so can I, because I had a Western education which wasn't always very pleasant, but it did also put me in a more empowered position. And so the issue though for me is all too much, and I address this in my own writing, is that all too much that there is a great discrepancy between, and particularly there was, but it still is occurring, a discrepancy between home culture, what it's like with Indigenous families, different family values, and I'll just give you a quick example of that. In Australia, there's a magic number of how many people should live in a house that is normal. And a normal Australian household, this is actually a non-Indigenous household. A normal Australian household is like mum and dad and, 2 to 3 kids, 2 kids, I think, if you're white. And so any other kind of presence in that house, like the presence of extended families, is seen to be overcrowding. And the Indigenous people get this label at school all the time. Yeah, they live in overcrowded houses. And that is some way seen as impoverishment. But actually, that's denying a very long-standing cultural tradition of involving aunts, uncles, grandmas in the educational process of the child, which is really important. And that was really important to me. And I don't think my Western education would have been so successful on the one hand, even though it was quite painful in some ways, without the alternative take on things that I got at home. And so the issue is that schools often see Indigenous culture, the culture itself, as a deficit, and that makes a disconnect, and they don't know a lot about Indigenous values. Like I just gave a quick example about extended families, for example. And the fact that a lot of Indigenous kids have more than one mum or dad, and that an auntie and an uncle in some situations are also a mum and dad, or that it's quite acceptable to have two mums. And schools are just not always receptive to that. And recently I know a child who actually got into a bit of trouble for saying she's got two mums. And school was also confused, wondering if they were gay, you know, like so, not that they thought that was negative, but that's how they kind of took it. And so you can't learn at school. This is my point, this is the bottom line. No child can learn at school unless their home culture is valued and unless the home culture is brought into the classroom. And so, you know, when I was a child, I never saw an Aboriginal person come into a school to share their knowledge. And they're the kind of things, and they are happening slowly. But until there's an Aboriginal presence in the classrooms, all sorts of classrooms, from early childhood classrooms right through to tertiary classrooms, until there's actually a visible Indigenous presence and some sort of acknowledgement that people understand the values of Indigenous people, which might be different values from settler people. And of course there are some values we all share too. Like I think I don't know any Indigenous people who don't believe in like democracy, you know, broad values that we all share, or freedom of speech that Marie mentioned. But at a more grassroots level, we're all quite immersed, whether we want to or not, in white culture, but white culture is not so immersed in Indigenous culture. And yes, there has been some, since I was a child, since I was educated, yes, there has been some movement in the right direction, but it's still moving too slowly. And one of the reasons why there's a gap still, people have spoken about gaps in terms of educational levels for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous peoples, health levels for Indigenous and non-Indigenous, life expectancy. And so there will always be a gap in education levels between Indigenous and non-Indigenous while schools are not properly embracing Indigenous culture. Because no child will go to school and have their home criticised. They may not openly speak about it, but they will resist internally. And nothing that you can present to them until you show respect for their background, for their culture, for the kind of family that they live in. You don't have to agree, but you have to respect. Then those gaps will always be there. And you know, there's the biggest gap, despite health, education, life expectancy, one of the biggest gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is the headspace, is the gap between the ears of non-Indigenous people in terms of their attitudes to Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeanine. Brenton, you learned to read and write, you were basically self-taught, and you learned to read and write through visual images. Can you tell us a little bit about your creative process and how that translates? What is it that comes to your mind first? And I know you've been taking notes while you've been here in Bangalore, looking at people's faces and looking at how things are happening. So perhaps you could share some of that with us.
Yeah, And admittedly too, I guess that I finally made this confession once before, but I actually struggle reading novels even today. Like I don't read any novels. Sorry. It's there. I will get around to it. It's a time thing. I'm a very busy man, but I do read a lot of graphic novels. And unfortunately, and it's been a good thing because they've made graphic novels of some very popular books, which made my life a lot easier. But yeah, no, it wasn't just me growing up. I went to a school called St. Mary's College, St. Mary's Primary and Secondary, which is a very Catholic school. And growing up, I was always told that you can't speak Yaru, which is our native language, at school. And when we were at school, it was strictly English. So I guess there was some confusion to begin with. We go home and speak Creole or Yaru or whatever we did, and we come to school and told that we had to speak English. And reading English wasn't just me. We all kind of suffered a lot, So I consider myself quite lucky, And I think, I had a way out. Like a lot of my cousins who are sports. They've grown up to become sports people, footballers and boxers and stuff. I don't know. They kind of found my way out by learning through pictures. And today they call it visual literacy today. And schools are advocating graphic novels all the time now. When I was growing up, it was quite different. Like, if I got caught in class with a comic book, I got detention instantly. And the teachers all called it, pulp fiction or rubbish, or it's going to rot your brain, and all these things. But it didn't deter me. I kept reading, and it was always the pictures first. The pictures told me the story first. And, just looking at the same comic, maybe take me 3 days. I'd read the comic pictures first. Take me another 3 days to slowly piece the words together to try and find out what was happening. And that's how I learned. And at the time they called it rubbish, they called it pulp fiction, but now I went to the Reading Matters conference in 2011. This was in Melbourne. The entire audience was school teachers and librarians. And I kept telling myself, I think I'm in the wrong place. Like, I'm not supposed to be here. But no, and a lot of their questions was, how do we keep our kids engaged, and how do we teach them how to read? How do we do a lot of these things? And I gave them my secrets. I said, no, that's comic books is it's a underestimated learning tool. So and I've visited a lot of schools around Melbourne, and sure enough, like I've gone from my childhood where comic books were sacrilegious, I guess, or they just weren't allowed, to a point where teachers are literally throwing them at students. But the one thing I keep seeing a lot now, especially, and that's why I'm also trying to advocate, because I tell my graphic novelist first, and say that I'm an Indigenous person second, because that's the way it's kind of saved me, like being Indigenous is kind of, it's been great, but it's also been quite painful as well, and I've always found a lot of my answers by being a graphic novelist, and unfortunately, like a lot of the metropolitan schools have caught on to this, in Broome itself, the town I come from, there's very little love for graphic novels. They're only just sort of grasping it, but they're not even using it still. So it's strange. I'll go to Perth, Adelaide or Melbourne, and they're full engines. They want me to go there, do all these workshops, work with young kids and do a lot of these things in remote communities, and especially the town where I come from. The idea that you can use a comic book to help educate someone is still considered backwards, So there's a lot of things, and I guess that's what I'm trying to do, other than be a successful graphic novelist. And first and foremost, want to try. I know there are kids out there who are in my shoes when I was that age, So I'm trying to, every workshop I go to, I try to see which handful of kids are those that are struggling the most, and just see if an extra tip or an extra secret or something will help them stay engaged. And what comic books did for me, I hope does for them.
Thank you. Are there any questions? I'm sure that our writers.
I have a question.
I come from a heartland of Indigenous peoples, the Nilgiri Hills. My question is this: your literatures are obviously oral literatures, the Indigenous peoples. Is there a script, Or is it just by memory and by word of mouth that you are preserving your literature?
We still have an oral tradition where I come from. I come from the Northern Territory, I come from Arnhem Land, and we still have our oral stories and that we still pass down, that we've been passing down forever and ever. But you know, we're in the 20th century now, and there's other ways that we preserve and keep our things going, and we create new things too. So, yeah.
Also, in an official capacity, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, which is quite a unique institute. It is actually a collection and research institute that was set up in 1964 in its original form, devoted to Indigenous preservation of Indigenous heritages, particularly languages, has a whole team of Indigenous linguists working on what are described as endangered. We don't call the languages dead, because that's defeatist. The languages may be sleeping. So there is a whole team of Indigenous linguists who work on the preservation of different languages, and yes, as Marie said, yeah, 20th century now, so they are being documented and phonetically so, in terms of spelling. People say, how do you accommodate the spelling? Well, okay, it is phonetic, and it is determined by particular people who speak that language. So there is a growing database, and some languages are actually waking up, and some languages are being taught. There's a Wiradjuri language program, for example, taught in not all across the Wiradjuri, but there are a number of schools, particularly in regional areas where there are high, and this is a good example also of my earlier point about the school actually developing respect and encompassing Indigenous culture. All the kids, not just the Aboriginal kids, all the kids do a certain time of day, like maths or English, a little bit of Wiradjuri language every day. So there are actually even some schools doing that too. But about 20, 30 years ago, people were still saying the Wiradjuri language is dead. But no, it was asleep, but there were still, and it became quite surprising too how many speakers there were left, because Dylan mentioned, Marie mentioned, Brenton mentioned that the older people used to get into trouble for speaking their languages, so they appeared to have stopped. But it wasn't quite that simple. A lot of people didn't actually stop. It went underground. But, you know, about 20 or 30 years ago, when this revival began to happen that Mridula keeps mentioning, and when people thought it was safe, like there were some Wiradjuri elders still speaking Wiradjuri, and that allowed it to be documented by linguists. And similar patterns have happened like that across Australia with Indigenous languages. But we are primarily still oral, like we prefer the oral transmission. But there is also the advantage, I suppose, of being able to record it now too.
Thank you.
To add to that, one of the languages, I speak 5 languages, English being the 5th one, but one of my languages, Tiwi, I've noticed just within even 20 years that it's changing, you know, and how it was spoken 20 years ago to how, you know, it's being spoken now. And so, I mean, there's one part of my brain that thinks, what a dreadful thing, because our language isn't the same. But then also, it's still there though, so, you know, there's a small comfort, I guess, that we still can all converse in our language when I go home. But it's changed, it's so different. So, yeah, where does it go? Where does this sort of like preservation of our language go? It's a tragedy to think that it's not going to be, in another 20 years, what the Tiwi language will sound like. Who knows? But, you know, but anyway, still there for the moment.
Hi. Okay, I'm sorry if you cover this in the first 5 minutes. I came a little late, but this has just been kind of bothering me. Like the word Indigenous is a little. It has a lot of, like, it's a little heavy. Like I feel like it's a word that kind of comes from a culture of colonialism itself. So are we using it in wait, sorry. Like, is the language itself kind of meant to construct the indigenous people as like the others, just with that word? Like, or am I using it wrong? Or are we not looking at the holistic meaning of the word, or what? I don't know.
Yeah, look, that's actually a very good question. Among Australian Indigenous people, we do find the word problematic to an extent because it's so generic. It is a political term. Then there are other practicalities, and it also homogenises a very important diversity. There are other considerations, though, that Australian, the first peoples of Australia, and I think that would be a better term to use, Australia's first peoples. But the first peoples of Australia are also mainland Aboriginal people, but they're also Torres Strait Islanders. So distinctly different there again, as well as the mainland diversity. And I think there is some, there has to be some consideration about, in terms of government policy, addressing all the Indigenous peoples of Australia. But it has become, among ourselves, we tend to introduce ourselves as all us four did here. Wiradjuri, Marie was Tiwi, and sorry, I get them all. Anne Rabaranga, and Dylan said she was Guthiga, and Brenton, yeah, Daru. That's a way of also addressing it among ourselves. It's a very important stance to take as well. Yeah, it's a good question. It is a colonial construct and it has its dangers, but we are critical of it.
Just to say that certainly we identify ourselves from our language groups, and even say within the state of South Australia we refer to ourselves as younger people, and then the say East Coast refer to themselves as Puris. They have their specific language groups, and then Queensland Murri, and then Noongar, Australia. So there's sort of Yulnu for top end. So every language has their own identification specifically for the language, sometimes for the region, broadly, and certainly, as Jeanine has said, that the word Indigenous is very problematic, and there's actually discussions quite regularly within the academy around this terminology, because it does have a premise that comes from, as Jeanine mentioned, a colonial, sort of labelling, and so that it doesn't identify the diversity within our cultures, and certainly First Nations or First Peoples is a preferred terminology, but when policies are being made and this terminology is being used, it's sort of, people identify with that. But we ourselves, in terms of our own identification and in terms of our own decolonising position, use words that identify ourselves. But it's an ongoing discussion, and you're very in tune to pick up on that. Yes.
And just as a quick follow-up, there is another problem with the term that we all recognise as problematic is it comes from, it was initially used to describe flora and fauna, Indigenous flora and fauna, and has become extended then to people. So we're all conscious of that as well, and we would prefer to be the nation's first people. And the Americans do that, but I think there is some reticence with Australian governments, bipartisan, to actually use the term first.
And the reason why is because we were never recognised as the first people. We were never offered a treaty or treaties, and even today we have no representation in Parliament, or very little, and we have no self-government like other First Nation peoples have, because treaties were offered. So very problematic for the government to acknowledge us in those broad forms.
Yeah, I have a question for you. Is there a set of common properties among the indigenous languages? Can you classify indigenous languages and cultures into groups based on commonality? Just like you can classify English, German, and Dutch.
Is that on? Oh yeah. No, there are so over 600 languages and dialects, but languages, complete separate languages. The Tiwi language is the only one in Australia that is just complete suffixes and prefixes, and then no other language in Australia is the same as the way the Tiwi language is put together. Rembaranga, another language of mine, is so complicated that, I mean, you know, unless you know it from a little kid, it's very, very difficult to learn, and it's got its own sort of like special, unique, you know, way it all sort of goes together. So no, they're separate language groups, because we were separate groups of people who lived in harmony with whoever was around us, but we were our own little groups. And my family in Arnhem Land, we were a political group, so the languages and the words within Rembaranga relate to political things. And we could, like my Uncle Jeffrey, he speaks 17 different languages and dialects from the top end. And my mother, she spoke the same as well. And we, for ceremonial purposes, we know languages to converse with other people and other groups around us. But our language, when I'm at home, you know, if I'm with family in Arnhem Land, we speak our Rembaranga or Barada or, you know, Jawan. When I'm in the Tiwi Islands, we speak our Tiwi. So, but they're different and distinct, and they're not dialects, you know, as a whole. And the people in the centre, the way their languages are structured, is very, very different to the top end. And I've heard it said, but I don't know. But you know, the languages in the centre are very much like the way the French language is structured. So, but no, they're very different and very distinct.
And I was just going to add too that, say, Gugutha, for example, our language, we have tribal affiliations with Yankunytjatjara, Pitjantjatjara, Ngiri. And so even though we have our distinct language, because of the connections in terms of our culture where people come together for ceremony, where there's, you know, traditionally has been trade routes across various areas, that there are these important cultural connections with groups that are around us. And although each language is distinct, some words are similar or the same. There's an old Pitjantjatjara woman who comes to visit me regularly in at work at the university, and we always sit down and have a cuppa, and I'm constantly talking with her in language. Some words are different, some words are similar, but we're very closely, we're both Western Desert peoples, but even with that close connection there are incredible differences. So, you know, we're constantly talking and comparing.
Mine is more a request than a question. It would be great if we could hear a little bit of the language, of all your language, if we just hear it. So either in reading or speaking.
There's a green light now. It's okay. How's that? In Tiwi, let me think. Awana Ngari Mamtawi, and that means hello, all my friends. So yeah, I don't know.
I think I spoke a little earlier in language. Can I read a little bit? Do you want me to read where there's Aboriginal English and language? I'll just turn somewhere. Here we go, maybe here. Mission won't, this is quite interesting that I've turned to this page in this section, actually. Thank you, ancestors. Always guiding. You got to talk, okay, so I'll start from here. Okay, sometimes, okay, so that's, we taught that when we were young, we taught how to be respectful like that. That's Nyanga way. That's another way how we're different from Walbyumuga, that's white people. We talk in other ways. We don't have to have talk going on and on, Wanganyi non-stop. Something that we say got a lot of quiet, sometimes we say a lot of things quiet way to each other without opening our mouth. And they don't know what we're saying, that's white fellas, white people. We got to talk like that sometimes, because the Malbiumuga on the mission, they don't even let us they don't let us use Gugudawonga either. That's our own language. We got to talk English. We talk our Gugudawonga loud way at home, but not when they're around. At school, if teacher hear us, she growl and sometimes hit us on the mara that's on her hand with the ruler. So we talk in a whisper. Jobri weena bunri bunri. That means silly woman bossy boots. That's what teacher is sometimes. That's what us kids call her anyway. I imagine if I said that out loud way in English, teacher would give me a good hiding. So when we can't talk or even whisper in lingo, because they're listening, we use our mara, that's our hands, and other parts of our body to talk safe way. Sometimes it's real important to talk to each other without wanganyi, without talking, especially when welfare mob come. That's when we got to talk real quiet way, or they might grab us fair-skinned gijiramuga as children, and we'll never see our family again.
Thank you. I do things differently because I wasn't raised to speak any languages, and neither were the generation before me, because where I come from, the Wiradjuri was colonised very early in the colonial calendar. But what I did was unconsciously when I was a child, but then later on became conscious of it, and a lot of it Aboriginal people do this who don't actually speak, say, a pure language like Dylan did or like Marie can, speak Aboriginal English, which means they use words very differently. And it is not the same as the standard English, and there is an impact power in that as well. And just a couple of quick examples is Aboriginal people often use the word, yes, it's deadly, and I've referred to something in my book, a new game that we learnt to play that we used to love, and I called it a deadly game. But deadly doesn't have the same connotations as it does in English. If an Aboriginal person tells you something's deadly, it means it's fantastic, it means it's great. And so a deadly game is a really good one. And even if you do speak English, you won't get that if you're not savvy with Aboriginal culture and English. Another quick example would be once I did something wrong and my auntie said she was going to jar me. And people, ooh, jar, put you in a jar? No, jar, shake you up, you know, like reprimand you. And another one that people say all across Australia now too, Aboriginal English is kind of like a bit national too, is gammon. I said it on the first page actually, it's something my auntie and grandmother used to say a lot when I was a kid, that yeah, such and such is bloody gammon. It means they're stupid, it means they're silly, or it means they're fake. Yeah, depends how you use it in the context. And just the last quick example we'll give you is I've also referred to someone as solid. They were really solid. And you're all thinking they might be a bit of a fatty. But no, solid, if you call someone solid, it means they're great, they're strong. It's a bit like deadly, you know. Now if I said quite appropriately that Mridula is deadly and solid, I'm paying her the highest compliment. Thank you.
Yeah, basically, yeah, growing up, we speak like Creole, like Pidgin English, which is bits of Yarru. It wasn't so much Yarru purely, like my mum speaks fluent Yarru, but we kind of grew up more with Creole, which is a mix of Yarru, English, bits of Malaysian, Chinese, and stuff like that. And I was just thinking, what could I, and I remember my partner's Italian, so she grew up in Adelaide. She knew nothing of Indigenous culture until she met me. And I just remember this one of my experiences was when she first met my grandmother, you know, my grandmother who's was an incredibly hard woman, you know, and we were at my nan's place and there was all my cousins and she was my girlfriend at the time and she was the only girl in the room. And she remembers this because this is the first thing that she learnt in our language, or Creole, or yeah, anyway. And I saw her then walk through the door, and my nan was quite broad. And she looked around, and all us boys were just staring, and she looked at Tiny Tawa to introduce herself. And the first thing was what my nan said was, "Wagan, ubelang ditian yakaria," and it basically means who owns this white person, you know. So but yeah, and that's my that was the first thing she learned. She's like, "What did she say?" "Ubelang ditian yakaria," and that's what it basically means who owns this white girl, you know, like and I put my hand up, and she said, you know, and she didn't even know, like Tan always thought Indigenous words, like there was no language, she just thought we communicated in like grunts and huffs and stuff. So her having a team background, they didn't realise that we actually had a language, you know, so that's the first thing she learned, and bit by bit, listening to my mums, my aunties, and sadly my grandmother passed away in 2005, but in that short time that she knew my grandmother, like they bonded very closely, and she picked up a lot of things, and at one point she knew a lot of like town gossip, a lot of stuff going on, and even words that even I didn't know, you know. So I dare say, and I believe it may be with a lot of Indigenous languages as well that's been presented today, is like I think Indigenous language is quite infectious, rather like Australian or Indian. Like I think there's something really attractive about it. So yeah.
I was just going to add, if that's okay, that I get emails from non-Indigenous white people, non-Aboriginal people, who are now using Guga words as part of their everyday life since reading the book. And I think we're educating, in the process of us being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander riders, that we're educating the broader public about our culture, and I think that's one of the biggest gifts that we can give as part of that decolonising process, is for people to come to our centre rather than us being on the periphery.
Could you please join me in thanking our Australian Indigenous visitors for speaking to us.
Thank you, panelists. That was indeed a wonderful session.
Go to our website, www.literarycommons.com. It's in the brochures that you have been handed out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would now request the panelists to sign on the BLF wall. Those who would wish to get their books signed, kindly head to the signing area right behind the help desk. Since this edition is dedicated to the memory of late Dr. U.R. Ananthamurthy, do visit a photo exhibition on him in the cafeteria. Inquisition, the BLF Books quiz on Nexus Consulting, is from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. at the bookstore. This year, the BLF is not simply about the written word. We have at the festival a wonderful showcase of contemporary art and sculpture. BLF, in association with our venue and hospitality partner, Crown Plaza Bengaluru Electronic City, proudly presents Forms, Faces, Forces, an exhibition celebrating motifs and emotions that books bring alive. Curated and conceptualized by Gallery G, the exhibition is on at the Crown Plaza Hotel lobby as well as in the festival area. Thank you.